As you may know if you follow me on Twitter, I've been having a lot of issues with my eyes lately, and I haven't been able to do as much research as I typically like to do for videos. So this one's going to be a bit more casual than my others, just gonna respond to some stuff and fire off some lukewarm takes for your listening pleasure. Let me know how you feel about this. Maybe comment some thoughts or questions you'd like me to respond to in another video. Let me also make this clear from the start. I don't want anyone bullied or bothered. I'm blacking out names. Don't harass people, especially not on my behalf. Okay, so I can't find this comment now, and I don't feel like using my limited screen time to look for it. Good job, Leslie. Great start. Very professional. But in my first video, I used the word insane, and was rightfully criticized for it. I kind of didn't even notice because I used it to refer to myself and my erratic sleep, but that's still not really okay. So I feel obligated now to address this bit of ableism on the left. Yeah, I know. Another lecture on language from a leftist SJW. Why must I hate cops but love policing language? A lot of leftists are still kind of at ground zero figuring out that using slurs is not okay. Why is it not okay? Well, I haven't touched on that because honestly, language doesn't generally interest me much. And it tends to feel sort of pedantic after a while. I feel like maybe language isn't ground zero for a lot of people, and once you've addressed other biases, then their language tends to follow suit. Is that a hot take? Did this become spicy? Language is something to be aware of, and it certainly indicates bias, but it's not necessarily something I personally care to focus on. I've actually known several edgy gamer bros who used to use the N-word, as well as other slurs, and scoffed at snowflakes who were triggered by that, before forming friendships with people with diverse experiences, learning about systemic oppression in college, coming out as queer, or otherwise learning more about marginalized identities. As far as I can remember, at no point in any of my social theory classes was I ever specifically told not to say slurs. I just didn't anyway. Now, these former edgy bros make fun of white people who use the N-word. Maybe their humor simply matured with age, but I think it had a lot more to do with experience and respect. When people don't see another group as fully human, and you, a person of that group, tell them to stop using a word, they're not going to recognize your authority or your pain. Your experience doesn't mean anything to them. It's a frustrating, pointless conversation and just really not worth engaging in for me. Telling people not to say specific words isn't nearly as effective as teaching people to see others as human. And no, I'm not saying stop telling people not to use slurs or be comfortable around people who do. You should not be comfortable around people using slurs, and you should let your discomfort be known. I guess I'm saying that I personally don't like putting my energy into critiquing language on the internet just in real life with people who I know already respect my opinions and see me as human. There are already so many videos and articles by more articulate and educated people than me explaining why you shouldn't use ableist language or slurs. I've linked to a really great article by Lydia X.C. Brown in the description where they've made the most exhaustive list of words and phrases that can be considered ableist that I've ever seen. I don't necessarily agree with avoiding every item on the list, and the author themselves makes it clear that they don't either. But I still thought it was interesting and informative. If anything, it serves as an excellent source on how deeply ableist language is woven into our speech. I generally don't think it's productive for people to try and memorize a list of words that are off limits, especially not if they use this list of words to superficially critique other people's language rather than doing a deeper analysis of the underlying ideas and structures which lead to the use of such language. The intent behind language will always be more important than the individual words, and I think most people can agree with that. That's the difference, to me, between using slurs, like the R slur, and using more commonplace words like dumb. At this point in time, there's really no excuse for not being aware that slurs hurt people. Using them while not being part of a community that's reclaimed the slur is malicious. Well, okay, there's no community I'm aware of that's reclaimed the R slur, but you get the idea. You know it hurts people. If I said, hey, can you stop pressing that button labeled stab disabled people in the eyeball? It hurts to be stabbed in the eyeball. Any person who understands disabled people are sentient beings wouldn't press that button. Basically, as we all know, language changes and shifts with time, so I'm willing to excuse ignorance or force of habit for most of these. But I don't think anyone can claim ignorance when it comes to the harm done by slurs. If someone says, that guy's dumb, I'm not going to assume they mean he's mute. which is the original use of the word. The ableist part of using dumb is that historically we've associated being nonverbal with being unintelligent, and being unintelligent, whatever that means, with not being valuable. If pressed for clarification, the original speaker might say, well, when I said dumb, I mean that guy is uninformed or ignorant. I mean he makes bad choices, not that he has a disability. Then they might remember once hearing the phrase deaf and dumb and make a connection there. The average person has likely never really thought about the history of the word dumb, nor have they ever met anyone offended by it. Honestly, I'm not offended by it unless, of course, it's used to imply disability. But it's typically used to imply ignorance or something being illogical or extraneous or goofy. There's definitely something to be said about the imprecision of ableist language. The history of it's bad, yeah, just like the weirdly violent phrase, killing two birds with one stone. I definitely don't want to kill any birds with any stones, but sometimes I'll use this phrase when appropriate because it's a common colloquialism. It's the first thing to come to mind, and I know I'll be understood. Disabled people know that often when people describe a thing as dumb, stupid, or crazy, they don't mean it's mute, intellectually disabled, or mentally ill. We know you mean it's unreasonable, illogical, or erratic. We know you don't have malicious intentions. The core problem is using what used to be medical terminology to diminish the value of something or someone. Saying something is idiotic means that thing is harmful, bad, or not of value, and unfortunately strengthens the association we have between people with intellectual disabilities, who would have been diagnosed medically as idiots, and lack of value. So the defense, no, intellectually disabled person, I don't mean you when I say idiot, is true. They don't consciously mean to refer to intellectually disabled people. Idiot no longer means that in our culture. But it's also kind of false. Kind of. George Carlin noted many years ago that we keep changing our words for things, and it gets kind of absurd, like instead of toilet paper, companies might brand their product bathroom tissue, or instead of shell shock, it's post-traumatic stress disorder. Which I have to disagree with Carlin on that one specifically, as well as several other things he's said here, though he does still make some valid points. PTSD is a much better and more inclusive diagnosis, since a person can have post-traumatic stress from situations that don't involve warfare. Changing the name opened up treatment to survivors of other forms of trauma.
They say they're going to pre-board those passengers in need of special assistance. Cripples! Simple, honest, direct language. There's no shame attached to the word cripple that I can find in any dictionary.
Of course there's no shame attached to the word cripple in the dictionary. That's not how dictionaries work. That's how connotation works. Not only that, but passengers in need of special assistance can mean people who are pregnant, children flying alone, autistic people, or otherwise people in need of assistance but who may or may not have any kind of disability. There are a lot of people who may need assistance with boarding a flight who wouldn't feel included and may not get the assistance they need if airlines said, "Attention passengers, it's cripple boarding time." Despite these problems, he makes a good point about how we keep changing the language surrounding disabilities and it can feel kind of endless. But I don't think he fully understood the implications here.
These poor people have been bullshitted by the system into believing that if you change the name of the condition, somehow you'll change the condition.
Yeah, no one thinks that. But I think that's why I and many other disabled people refuse to be called people with disabilities or handy-capable individuals or
differently abled.
Any of these nonsense euphemism phrases that abled people invent and use because they're uncomfortable, which Carlin correctly pointed out are ridiculous.
You can't even call these people handicapped anymore. They'll say, we're not handicapped, we're handy-capable.
No, we won't. I think my point is that sometimes language is changed to be more specific and inclusive, like in the case of shell shock to PTSD, and sometimes language is changed in an attempt to outrun negative associations, like in the case of bathroom tissue or handy-capable. There's nothing wrong with toilet paper, and there's nothing wrong with disabled people. The R slur is one of these inaccurate words which also happens to have a lot of negative associations, to say the least. To every middle school band teacher's chagrin, retardando in music means to slow down, which implies that intellectual disabilities make a person slow. But that's not necessarily true. A person may test at a low IQ, yet pick up on certain things considerably faster than the average person. There are people like Derek Paravicini, who has a verbal IQ of 58, but can play any song on the piano after hearing it just once.
Not only does Derek play the piece back, note for note, but his ability to improvise and play around with the melody is simply stunning.
Good. What would George do with it? Chords.
Not exactly slow, is he? Intellectual disabilities are not a matter of quickness or slowness, it's a matter of ability to process information in the ways presented to you by intelligence tests. Whatever words we use to describe disability almost always will be used as insults because people associate disability, particularly intellectual disability, with badness and a lack of value. Across the political spectrum, we can see people calling others intellectually disabled or mentally ill as a way of delegitimizing their positions or insulting them. It's like how people used to say, "That's so gay," when referring to bad things, because homosexuality was and still is associated with badness. Moving away from "that's so gay" was difficult, but it was helped by queer people celebrating when things really were
Gay, 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 what do you say? Hey, 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 hey.
But can the disabled community do the same thing celebrating crip culture and neurodiversity? I don't really know. I hope so. The problem is that a lot of disabilities are inherently bad, and by that I mean painful, like various chronic pain conditions. But obviously there are so many others that aren't. And there's no disability I can conceive of that makes a person less valuable. That's kind of the core of ableism, isn't it? Believing that disabled people are inherently less valuable or actively a threat. Telling people not to say dumb feels pretty far removed from the work of challenging this incredibly dangerous and ignorant core belief. So I don't engage with language arguments online. I personally prefer to avoid ableist language and hopefully set an example, but I don't find it useful to critique other people's language unless I already know they're open to that discussion. As I mentioned before, I've seen plenty of people use current medical terminology in destructively ableist ways, and this is far worse. People on the left will often say someone is mentally ill or intellectually disabled as a way to explain their ignorance, racism, or selfishness. A person can, of course, be both racist and intellectually disabled, but the two things have nothing to do with one another. You don't have to be a big brain boy to understand that Black Lives Matter and you should treat people with kindness. Never mind that the size of brains has nothing to do with IQ anyway. And just think of how many academically gifted people with high IQ scores believed in nonsense like phrenology and alchemy and trickle-down economics. Those people were highly intelligent in all the ways we still define intelligence, but were educated with bullshit. Having harmful beliefs is not an intellectual disability. It's just regular old exposure to propaganda. The bad kind, not my kind. People can avoid the R slur and still have deeply ableist ideas which are far more dangerous than any slur could possibly be. So anyway, that's all I care to say about language. It's not something that's super important to me personally, even though it is important in general. Do you really think socialism will be better for disabled people? Stalin would have killed you in a heartbeat. I've predictably gotten quite a few comments like this on my videos, some nicer, some less so. The point of this is typically not to point out that ableism may carry over into other economic systems, but just a way to own leftists by pointing out that any system other than capitalism might also have flaws, and it's better to stick with the ableism you know. They usually then go on to talk about disabled people being better off because of medical discoveries that couldn't be possible without capitalism because no one wants to help anyone or do science unless they can make a profit from it. Alexander Fleming? Never heard of her. Most comments are not like this, but I can't help but feel like this is, in some ways, a valid concern and something which ought to be taken seriously. No, stay with me. This thought is perfectly logical and reasonable when working from a production-driven framework, which most people, leftists included, are. Like many troll questions, there's a valuable discussion lurking beneath the laughable exterior. Now, here's essentially the same question, but from a leftist. How? How can we help people that want to be useful but struggle to do so? And when does help evolve into backseat driving? I never had to deal with issues that you had to struggle with, and even though I didn't know, I've been ableist my whole life, so much so that people's value always came down to what they were or were not able to do. To not condemn myself fully, it was not in the framework of work in order to profit, but overall value to their life, and to other people's lives around them. And I still can't find the golden section. For instance, in a socialized, democratized workplace, how could a person of lower mental capabilities vote, and how do you avoid that this person will be exploited? Do you demote that person into second-class citizen worker? Isn't that ableist? How does being less exploitable in a society without exploitation function? I find it easy for people like us, leftists, to unite when facing the dystopian reality of capitalism and its today late-stage form. However, when the common enemy disappears, how strong will this hold be? If there are not enough people that want to take care of these people, how can we work around that? This whole comment has been a useless rant provided by my own prejudices, I suppose, and I can see that. Yet, I still find myself feeling there's some truth in this. So here's my response. I appreciate this so much. I can really tell you're trying to wrap your head around some new information, and I love to see it. First, caregiving ought to be a community effort. This goes for both caregivers of disabled people and parents of children. It's ridiculous that we expect one or two parents to do all the work of full-time jobs and childcare when traditionally entire villages raise children. Most cultures raise children in multi-generational households with 5 or 6 other adults. Certainly, there aren't enough people to take care of disabled people right now when we devalue the work, often expect it to be done without pay, and expect only 1 or 2 people to be able to do it full-time entirely by themselves for their entire lives. Most caregiving work really isn't specialized labor. It's just stuff like you make lunch and you help them get the straw in their mouth. If we could even just cut the average work week in half, think of how much time people could have to spend with their community, how much more we could afford to value disabled people's joy over productivity. I'm not saying there will, for sure, be enough caregivers in a socialized system. I really can't know that. But it's hard to even conceptualize a world in which we value disabled people when working from a framework of maximizing productivity rather than maximizing happiness. So I understand the ableism struggle. There will always be some people that understand X thing better than someone else. Socialized workplaces still have project managers, directors, and supervisors, but that doesn't necessarily make the other workers lower than them in a hierarchical sense. They simply have different jobs. In an accessible world, policy changes would be available in plain language and in multiple mediums. Pros and cons would be explained in a way which is easily understandable and can be voted on by anyone who chooses to do so. But we can make up a hypothetical disabled worker who only understands how to link object A into object B, and that's their whole job. Maybe they're nonverbal and can't use AAC devices. In my utopian vision of the world, nonverbal people would learn to use AAC devices as a first resort rather than be subjected to years of verbal training, which typically has limited success. But I digress. All anyone can know is that they can do this job and seem to want to do so because they keep showing up and doing it. Now suddenly, there's a policy change the workers need to vote on. How can we communicate to this particular worker? How can they vote at all? I'd say talk to their caregivers, friends, and community members to find out if there are any ways they can communicate, and present the information to them in as many ways as possible. If it's absolutely impossible for them to make their desires known or even indicate they understand the policy change, then have multiple people who are close to them weigh in on the decision, not just one person, and don't eliminate their vote entirely. This is a totally made-up situation. Typically, people with communication disabilities can still communicate somehow, but it's unavoidable that sometimes caregivers or community members have to be deferred to in order to make decisions for people who can't do so for themselves. Having multiple people making this kind of decision, rather than one, would help minimize the potential for self-serving decisions. And that's just one example of a safeguard that can be put into place for disabled people in the workplace. This doesn't eliminate the possibility of manipulation, but it's certainly an improvement over our current system. I don't know if there can ever exist a utopia totally free of manipulation and abuse, but empowering the workers and giving them ownership over their labor no longer tying employment to access to food, shelter, healthcare, or any other necessities, and valuing community care over individual caregivers would minimize the incentives for abuse and maximize opportunities to escape abuse. I just want to point out that I've now responded to a grand total of 2 comments in this video. I really can't stop myself from writing entire essays, so this is why I don't often respond to comments. Anyway, to continue my essay that no one asked for, I think what this genre of comment boils down to is the way we've been socialized to value people and ourselves based on what we can do rather than who we are. It comes from this deeply held Malthusian overpopulation and scarcity myth in our culture that tells us that there aren't enough resources unless everyone is working 40 hours a week or whatever, and if someone isn't doing that, then they're taking something from you. That in order to be happy, you have to be producing something, somehow. Otherwise, you're stealing from people, and what sort of person can be happy doing that? Why don't the disabled just become hedge fund managers, or stockbrokers, or Dogecoin miners, and contribute to society? The joke is that none of those jobs actually contribute anything of value. We really, truly don't need to work so much. Not only because of automation, but because we never needed to in order to meet our needs. Hunter-gatherers only work like 15 to 20 hours a week, blah 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 blah, fully automated gay space luxury communism. I'll link to the David Graeber article on bullshit jobs. If you watch this channel, you've probably already read it. It's cool and good to just exist sometimes and enjoy being alive. Accepting care without a corresponding increase in production isn't stealing anything from anyone. The food is there. The resources are there. Your comfort, security, and happiness adds value to the world, even if you don't use that happiness to produce anything. If we dedicated more time to community care and less to senseless and destructive production, then maybe we could all spend more time being present and appreciating other people's company, rather than their productivity. Speaking of community care, I decided to finally make a Patreon, so if you like the channel and want to support me, maybe help me buy some new glasses, then that'd be great. For $5 a month, you get your name in the credits, and for $10 a month, I'll read your name at the end of my videos. I also set up a coffee for one-time donations. Anything helps. And if you can't donate, don't worry about it. Liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing my videos is free. And dislikes too, that still shows engagement. And a special thank you to Aaron, Daddy James the Lib, Kate Epithet, Questing Refuge, Sidekick, and Oozeworm. And thank you to my other patrons as well.